The World Cup is supposed to unite people, but sometimes the cameras capture moments no one was prepared to see. These are the darkest World Cup moments ever broadcast. In 1996, the Guatemala national team was preparing to face Costa Rica in a 1998 FIFA World Cup qualifier in Guatemala City. But before the game could even begin, the stadium was already becoming dangerously overcrowded, and the warning signs were everywhere. Reports differ slightly on the exact numbers. Some later accounts said nearly 50,000 people were trying to attend, even though the stadium had only been capable of holding around 37,500 in the days before the match. Other reports at the time said approximately 60,000 fans came to a stadium with a capacity of around 45,000. But either way, the problem was the same. Too many people were trying to get into a stadium that could not safely hold them, and one of the reasons was counterfeit tickets. Thousands of fake tickets had reportedly been sold. The number of tickets exceeded the stadium's capacity, and once counterfeit tickets were added into the situation, attendance became impossible to control. Inside, the stadium was already full about an hour before the match was scheduled to begin. Fans were crammed into every corner of the stadium. Some sat dangerously on the highest walls. Others were next to the field lights, on top of the roof of the press boxes, and in the stairway access areas. Every open space seemed to be filled with people, and still, more supporters tried to enter. The worst pressure built around the General Sur sector. Fans who had not been allowed in tried to move through a narrow concrete passage, but the people in front had nowhere to go. And then the crowd surged. In moments, what had been a line of people trying to get into a football match became a human avalanche. People were pushed forward by the pressure from behind. Those at the front were trapped. Some fell and others were crushed against the barriers and the lower part of the stands. The movement of the crowd turned into panic, and then into a stampede. Fistfights reportedly broke out inside the crowd, making the situation even worse. Security forces could not stop the surge. One by one, people started to suffocate. This all happened before the match between Guatemala and Costa Rica had even started. Firefighters and police began trying to reach the victims. At one point, they had to cut through a chain-link fence to lower people down from the grandstands. Reporters at the scene described the victims with bruises, bloodied ears and mouths, broken arms and legs. Some had their clothes torn off in the crush. Firefighters covered bodies with coats and blankets as injured fans received medical treatment nearby. Guatemala's president, Alvaro Arzu, was present at the stadium, watching from a box seat. The presidents of both countries were reportedly there that night, and as the chaos unfolded, Arzu called off the match. But by that point, it was already too late for dozens of people. At least 84 had died. More than 100 were seriously injured, with hospitals treating hundreds for fractures, suffocation, and shock. Later summaries list more than 200 injured. Many of them were children. After the disaster, FIFA prevented the stadium from being used for international matches until the problems were fixed. That ban eventually lasted more than 2 years. To follow FIFA's recommendations, the stadium's capacity was lowered. At the time of the disaster, the stadium had no numbered or individual seating, which made crowd control even more difficult. In June 1962, Chile and Italy walked out in Santiago for what should have been a World Cup group stage football match. But by the time it was over, people would remember it by a different name: the Battle of Santiago. 2 players were sent off, punches were thrown, players spat at each other. The police had to intervene 4 times, and the referee in charge that day was Ken Aston, the English official who would later become closely linked with one of the most important changes in football history: yellow and red cards. But at this point, those cards did not exist yet. So Ken Aston had to control one of the most violent matches in World Cup history, with only his whistle, his gestures, and eventually, the police. Now, to understand why this game exploded so quickly, you have to look at what had happened before the first whistle. Chile was hosting the 1962 FIFA World Cup, only 2 years after the 1960 Valdivia earthquake, the strongest earthquake ever recorded in human history. The disaster had severely disrupted the country's organization and preparation for the tournament. And even before the World Cup began, there were people questioning whether Chile should have been allowed to host it at all. 2 Italian journalists wrote about Santiago in brutally insulting terms. They described it as a poor, miserable, backwards place. They mocked the phones, the taxis. They wrote about malnutrition, illiteracy, alcoholism, and poverty. They said the capital had only 700 hotel beds. They claimed entire neighborhoods were given over to open prostitution. And in one of the most inflammatory lines, they compared Chile hosting the World Cup to Mussolini sending the Italian Air Force to bomb London, adding that they didn't arrive. And when those reports reached Chile, the reaction was furious. Chilean newspapers fired back, describing Italians as fascists, mafiosos, and because some Inter Milan players had recently been involved in a doping scandal, drug addicts. The Italian journalists who wrote the original pieces were forced to flee the country, and in one Santiago bar, an Argentinian journalist was mistaken for an Italian, beaten up, and hospitalized. By the time Chile and Italy actually met on the pitch, the atmosphere was already poisonous. Italy had to face the host nation in front of a crowd that had been told, again and again, that Italy had insulted their country. The first foul came within 35 seconds. That was the warning. This was not going to be a normal football match. Just 8 minutes in, Italy's Giorgio Ferrini fouled Chile's Honorino Landa. Ken Aston sent him off. But Ferrini refused to leave the pitch. And this is where the match started to look less like football and more like a street fight that had somehow wandered into a World Cup stadium. Ferrini would not go. Players surrounded the referee. Arguments broke out. The situation became so chaotic that policemen had to come onto the field and physically drag Ferrini away. And while the referee was occupied trying to get Ferrini off the pitch, something else happened. Chile's Leonel Sanchez punched Italy's Humberto Maschio with a left hook, breaking his nose. But referee Ken Aston did not see it. He was still dealing with the sending off. So Sanchez stayed on the pitch. Italy were down to 10 men. One of their players had been dragged away by police. Another had suffered a broken nose. And the match was still only just beginning. In the 38th minute, Sanchez was fouled by Italian right-back Mario David. Seconds later, Sanchez retaliated by slapping David in the face. The linesman was only a few meters away. Still, Sanchez escaped punishment again. Then, a few minutes later, David tried to kick Sanchez in the head. This time, Ken Aston saw enough. Mario David was sent off as well. Italy were now down to 9 men. There were scuffles. There was spitting. Players kept clashing across the pitch, and the police had to intervene 3 more times before the match was finished. For long stretches, the game barely seemed like it was about goals at all. It was about anger and retaliation that had carried straight onto the field. And somehow, through all of this, the match continued and Chile eventually won 2-0. Ken Aston had now refereed both of Chile's matches at the tournament, but after the Battle of Santiago, he never oversaw another World Cup match again. He later became a senior figure on refereeing committees, and his experiences became part of the story behind the introduction of yellow and red cards. Because one of the strangest things about watching footage of this match today is realizing that the referee had no cards to show. Everything had to be communicated through words, pointing, and body language in a match where tempers were already out of control and language barriers made everything worse. When highlights were shown on British television a couple of days later, they were not shown the same night, because at the time, film of the matches had to be flown back to the UK. And when the footage finally aired, commentators introduced it with the following words.
The game you're about to see is the most stupid, appalling, disgusting, and disgraceful exhibition of football possibly in the history of the game.
It was also pointed out that this was the first time Chile and Italy had met, and hopefully the last. The two sides were drawn together again at the 1966 World Cup. Italy won that match 2-0, and while there was still unsporting play, it never reached the same level. In 2010, North Korea arrived at the World Cup for the first time in 44 years. This was a team representing one of the most closed and oppressive regimes on Earth, a place where failure, especially public failure, could mean far more than just criticism from fans or bad headlines in the media. They were drawn into Group G with Brazil, Portugal, and Ivory Coast. On paper, it was brutal, but at first, the team actually gave people a reason to believe. Their opening match was against Brazil, one of the most famous teams in football history. Inside North Korea, the game was not shown live. It was only broadcast later, 17 hours after the match. North Korea did far better than many expected, but Brazil still won 2-1. And for a team that had been expected to be completely overwhelmed, a narrow defeat against Brazil looked almost like a victory. North Korea even scored late in the match, giving their supporters something to cheer about. Then came the second game, this time against Portugal, and this time, in an unusually risky move, North Korea showed the match live on television. For a regime that normally controlled information so tightly, this was massive. The country had just watched its team stand up to Brazil, and now the government seemed confident enough to let people watch the next match as it happened. But almost immediately that decision became a disaster. Portugal scored once in the first half, then in the second half, everything collapsed. Goal after goal went in. By the end, Portugal had won 7-0. What had begun as a rare live broadcast of national pride became a humiliation shown in real time. And this wasn't just any loss. It was one of the heaviest defeats of the tournament. And for North Korea, it turned the World Cup from a hopeful return into an international embarrassment. Then, in the final group match against Ivory Coast, they lost again. So, after 3 games, they left the tournament without a single point, having conceded 12 goals, and in most countries, that would be painful. The coach would probably be criticized. The players would be mocked by newspapers, but eventually, everyone would move on. But this was North Korea, and according to reports, what happened after they returned home was far more disturbing. South Korean media reported that earlier that month, the team and manager were summoned to the People's Palace of Culture in Pyongyang. They were forced onto a stage in front of around 400 people, including government officials, students, athletes, and journalists. And then came what was described as a 6-hour humiliation. According to the reports, each player was criticized, one after another, for how they had performed at the World Cup. The only players who reportedly avoided this humiliation were Young Tae-se and An Young-hak, because they were based in Japan and had not returned directly to North Korea with the rest of the squad. But for the others, the punishment did not end with being criticized, because then, according to the reports, the players were told to step forward in turn and publicly criticize their own manager, Kim Jong-un. And this is where the story becomes even darker. Kim Jong-un had apparently been singled out for punishment. He was reportedly accused of betraying Kim Jong-un, the son and heir of then-leader Kim Jong-il. At the time, North Korea was preparing for a transfer of power, and reports suggested that if the national team had performed well at the World Cup, the regime had planned to credit that success to Kim Jong-un. In other words, a good World Cup could have been used as propaganda. There were rumors that Kim Jong-un had been sent to forced labor at a construction site in Pyongyang. Other reports said he had been made to work as a construction worker, and there were fears for his safety. Human Rights Watch later noted that there had been no reports of further harsh or sustained punishments, but also pointed out why there was still reason to be concerned. In North Korea, officials and public figures could face severe consequences for failure, and according to a South Korean intelligence source, athletes and coaches who disappointed the regime had previously been sent to prison camps. The source suggested the team may actually have escaped with light punishment, saying that given the expectations North Korea had for the World Cup, the regime could have done worse than just reprimand them for ideological shortcomings. Andrés Escobar was not the kind of footballer people expected to be connected to one of the darkest stories in World Cup history. He was a Colombian center-back, born in Medellin. He was known as the gentleman, a calm defender with a clean style of play, someone who carried himself with composure on the pitch, and someone who had worked to promote a better image of Colombia at a time when the country was often associated internationally with violence and drug cartels. But in the summer of 1994, everything surrounding Colombia's national team was under a different kind of pressure. This was the 1994 FIFA World Cup in the United States, and Colombia came into the tournament with huge expectations. But their campaign quickly started to collapse, and in their second group match against the host nation, the United States, one moment would change Andrés Escobar's life forever. The ball was played across by American midfielder John Harkes. Andrés stretched to block it, but instead of clearing the danger, he accidentally deflected it into his own net. The United States went 1-0 up, and eventually they won the match 2-1. For Colombia, this was disastrous. It meant that to have any chance of advancing to the next round, they needed to beat Switzerland in their final group match, but that alone would not be enough. They also needed the United States to beat Romania in the other match, happening at the same time. Colombia did their part, but Romania defeated the United States 1-0, and with that, Colombia were eliminated, finishing bottom of Group A. He had been trying to defend his country, but outside the stadium, in the reality Colombia was living through, at the time, football was not always just football. After the tournament, Andrés had the option to visit relatives in Las Vegas, Nevada, but instead he decided to return to Colombia, and that decision placed him back in Medellin only days after Colombia's World Cup elimination. 5 days after Colombia were knocked out, Escobar called some friends. They went out to a bar in the El Poblado neighborhood of Medellin. After that, they went to a liquor store. Then, shortly afterwards, they arrived at a nightclub. At some point during the night, his friends split up. By around 3 o'clock in the morning, Andrés Escobar was alone in a parking lot, sitting in his car. Then 3 men appeared. They began arguing with him. 2 of them pulled out handguns. And then Escobar was shot 6 times. It was reported that after every shot, the killer shouted, "Goal." Then the group drove away in a pickup truck, leaving Escobar bleeding in the parking lot. He was taken to the hospital, but about 45 minutes later, he died. He was only 27 years old. The murder was widely believed to be punishment for the own goal. And even if the exact motive and the people behind it would become the subject of disputes and allegations, the message the world took from it was horrifying. A player had made a mistake at the World Cup, and days later, he was dead. The shock traveled far beyond Colombia. The country's international image, already damaged by violence, was tarnished even further. And in the UK, the BBC even issued a public apology after pundit Alan Hansen during Argentina versus Romania the day after Escobar's murder commented that an Argentine defender, quote, "once shooting" for a mistake like that. Humberto Castro Muñoz, a drug cartel bodyguard in Colombia, was arrested on the night of July 2nd, 1994. The next day, he confessed to killing Escobar. Castro also worked as a driver for Santiago Gallón, who had allegedly lost heavily after betting on Colombia. In June 1995, Castro was found guilty of Escobar's murder. He was sentenced to 43 years in prison. But that sentence did not stay at 43 years. It was later reduced to 26 years because of his submitting to the ruling penal code in 2001. Because of further reductions from prison work and study, he was released on good behavior in 2005. In the end, Humberto Castro served around 11 years. His 3 alleged accomplices were acquitted. There were also allegations that the Gallón brothers had bribed officials to make the investigation focus only on Castro, the man who pulled the trigger. Prosecutors suspected Castro may have been following their orders, but they never had enough credible evidence to prove it in court. So in the end, Castro was convicted, while the Gallón brothers were not. On the evening of April 27, 1993, a military transport aircraft took off from Libreville, Gabon. On board was almost an entire national football team. This was Zambia's national team, known as the Chipolopolo, and at the time, they were one of the most promising teams in Africa. They had finished 3rd at the Africa Cup of Nations in 1990, and now, in 1993, they had their eyes on 2 things. Their next step was a 1994 FIFA World Cup qualifier against Senegal in Dakar, but getting there would not be simple. The flight had been specially arranged by the Zambian Air Force. Because of the distance, the journey was scheduled to make 3 refueling stops. But before this flight even left Zambia, there were already warning signs. The aircraft had entered service back in 1975, and by the time of this journey, it had recently spent months out of service. Test flights were carried out on April 22nd and April 26th, only days before the team was due to travel. And before the departure to Senegal, checks revealed defects in the engine. Carbon particles were found in the oil filters. There were disconnected cables, and there were traces of heating. Despite this, the flight went ahead as scheduled. At the first refueling stop in Brazzaville, more engine problems were noted. But again, despite the warning signs, the aircraft continued. Not every player was on that plane. 3 Chipolopolo players who were based with clubs in Europe had made separate travel arrangements from their clubs to Senegal. A few minutes after taking off from the second stop in Libreville, something went badly wrong. The aircraft's left engine caught fire and failed. The pilot was already under strain. He had also flown the team from a match in Mauritius the previous day, and according to the investigation, fatigue would later be considered one of the factors in what happened next. Inside the cockpit, the pilot attempted to respond to the fire, but he made a fatal mistake. Instead of shutting down the damaged left engine, he shut down the right one. That meant the aircraft had now lost power from both engines during the climb out of Libreville Airport, and with no power, the plane could not keep flying. Moments later, it fell into the Atlantic Ocean, around 500 meters offshore. All 25 passengers and 5 crew members were killed. Among the dead were 18 players, the national team coach, and support staff. The scale of the loss was almost impossible to process. It wiped out most of a generation of Zambian football in a matter of minutes. In 2002, $4 million was given to the families of the deceased players in compensation, but compensation could not replace what had been lost. Zambia still had World Cup qualifiers to play. They still had an Africa Cup of Nations coming up, and almost overnight, the country had to build a new national team from the ruins of the old one. A new side was quickly assembled, and at the center of it was Bwalia, the captain who had survived only because he had been traveling separately from Europe. The task in front of them was brutal. They had to complete Zambia's World Cup qualification campaign while carrying the memory of teammates who should have been playing beside them, and somehow they came close. Zambia narrowly missed qualification for the 1994 World Cup, finishing just 1 point behind Morocco. Only months after the crash, Zambia had to compete in a major tournament with a rebuilt team, and somehow, against all expectation, they didn't collapse. Playing an attacking style of football, the resurrected Zambian side reached the final against Nigeria. In 2012, Zambia reached the Africa Cup of Nations final. This time, the final was in Libreville, only a few hundred meters inland from the crash site. Before the final, the memory of the lost players hung over everything. The final against Côte d'Ivoire ended 0-0 after normal time and added time, so it went to penalties. And after a long shootout, Zambia won 8-7. Their first Africa Cup of Nations title was won in Libreville, near the place where the country had suffered its darkest football tragedy. The victory was dedicated to the players, coaches, staff, and crew who had died in 1993.